Chapter 25. The sheriff's station was empty, just the moment Eddie had been waiting for. He removed the pin he had stolen off the sheriff's uniform and then picked the lock on the cell. The terrorist in the cell next to him had his eyes closed, but Eddie wasn't sure if he was sleeping. Although the man had been hard to read, he was clearly an idiot. Aside from hunting down animals in the wild, pinpointing idiots was one of Eddie's great skills. Eddie didn't care what those terrorists wanted. Whatever grudge they had held that had calloused enough to make them kill anyone who stood in their way was their business. He figured they were in it for power. But what those idiots didn't understand was that true power couldn't be taken or tamed. You were born with it or not. Eddie learned he was born with it at a very young age. It was why he was the alpha predator wherever he went. And alphas were never caged. The lock finally clicked, and Eddie pushed against the iron doors that had held him in place for far longer than he would have liked. The door swung open, and Eddie stood at the precipice. All he had to do was step out, and he was a free man. There was no one left here to stop him.
Want to let me out too?
Eddie glanced over at the man in the cell. He hadn't moved, still in the same position on the cot, leaned back with his arms crossed, but his eyes were open now.
No,
Eddie answered.
Suit yourself,
he said.
My brothers will come and get me out. It's only a matter of time before our plan is set into motion.
Eddie said nothing, but he sneered. The dumb bastard had no idea what they faced when they came here. They could have picked any small town, but they chose one with another alpha predator, because that was who the forest ranger was. She might not have even realized it either. Eddie didn't think she did, because if she had, she wouldn't have let all those townsfolk belittle her as they'd done. But Eddie felt the forest ranger was starting to wake up. She was beginning to realize just how strong she was, and when she did realize it, those idiots wouldn't know what hit them. Eddie stepped out of the cell, immediately feeling like he could breathe again. It wasn't the first time he'd been arrested, but it was the first time he'd been caught during a hunt. Eddie headed to the closet, where the sheriff's deputies had put all of his gear. It was locked, but the key was nearby. It was another dumb choice from a bunch of dumb people. The fact that he had to stay in a cell for as long as he did, considering the caliber of authority holding him, only further fueled his anger. All of Eddie's things had been removed and individually bagged for evidence. He ripped the bags open and angrily threw them on the floor. It took him 10 minutes to collect everything, and another 15 minutes to store everything in his bag correctly. The last item Eddie had to reclaim was his rifle. He couldn't leave it behind, but it wasn't with his other belongings. Eddie searched the office, unsure where it had been placed, and he eventually found it in the gun locker. Eddie had a custom-made rifle. A hunter was only as good as his weapons, and Eddie had crafted the perfect gun to suit his purposes. It was the ideal measure of accuracy and power. It was an extension of him, more a part of him than any leg or limb. It was his heart, the engine that powered him. Without his weapon, he was nothing. But that wasn't entirely true. Eddie was still dangerous, even without it, and he had to prove it. The forest ranger had stolen more than Eddie's freedom. She'd stolen his confidence. He'd never encountered anyone who could track him the way she had. No other living creature, beast or human alike, had ever bested him. But this forest ranger was a different animal. She was someone hardened by the fires of life. This small town had the perfect conditions to create another alpha, just like himself. Eddie had grown up in a small town similar to this one. He had been through more small towns than anyone he'd ever met. They were all the same, more or less. Everyone had the same problems, joys, struggles, victories, and defeats. People wanted to believe they were special. But if they were honest with themselves, if they boiled down all the bullshit they dressed their lives up with, they'd come to utter a singular truth, that there was nothing special about them. The truth was hard to swallow for most people, and even harder for others to find. But the forest ranger wasn't an average person, and for once, Eddie believed he finally had an opportunity to rise to a challenge that suited his talents. But to beat her, Eddie needed to understand his new enemy. Eddie had heard the rumors in the town about Lacey Stone when they had first arrived. The Black Widow was what they called her, all because they believed she had killed her husband. There had been an investigation by the very sheriff who had partnered with her to bring him into custody. And if there was an investigation, then there was a file. Eddie didn't take long to find where the sheriff kept his files. In a town this small, it wasn't like they were dealing with loads of crime. The city's entire criminal history was distilled into a filing cabinet of 5 drawers, and the bottom 2 were empty. There was no coherent filing system, so it took Eddie a minute to search through the folders before he came across the one involving the forest ranger. He opened the first page, and the moment he saw the picture of the dead husband, he understood. There was a reason the forest ranger had allowed people to believe the Black Widow rumor. It didn't bother her that they thought she had killed her husband, because the truth was far worse. The more Eddie read about the case, the more he understood. He believed he had found the chink in the forest ranger's armor. She wasn't untouchable now that he knew this, but she would still be formidable. But the most important aspect of hunting was ensuring you understood your prey. The file in Eddie's hands told him exactly how to trap her. Because there wasn't just information about the death of the forest ranger's husband, there was also information about her family. Children, to be specific. The forest ranger had a daughter and a son. Eddie had learned long ago that the quickest way to trap an animal, specifically a female, was to use their offspring as leverage. Eddie smiled when he saw the address listed on the file. He would pay them a little visit and reestablish himself as the superior alpha predator he was destined to become. Chapter 26. After the fight, everyone allowed themselves to take a breath. It wasn't until the shooting stopped and that missile fell from the sky that Dusty realized how tired he was. The adrenaline that had been fueling him since that morning when he'd left the campus had finally run its course. The tank was empty. He'd gone as far as he could, and it just so happened that it was enough for them to win the day. However, Dusty couldn't help but wonder how easily things could have turned out far worse. Questions of what could have been done differently raced through his mind. If only he had been a little faster to react, then maybe Professor Edwards would still be alive. If only he had been one step ahead, he could have saved more students. They were questions for another day, when he had the strength and fortitude to ask them aloud. But other questions needed answers as well, such as whether there were any more terrorists coming their way. The sheriff assured him that he would look into it, and Dusty was fine with it because all he could think about was going home and sleeping. Dusty glanced over at his mother, amazed she was still standing. The wound she had sustained on the side of the mountain was bad. The rock had cut her deep, and the patch job Dusty had given her didn't hold up during the heat of the fight. He had redressed the wound, using butterfly stitches since he had the time, and then put a clean wrap on it. His mother said nothing as he worked on her shoulder, barely even wincing. She stood in front of the park's welcome center, where they had all gathered after the fight on the trail. She hadn't said much on the walk down, but the few glances that Dusty stole told the same story that he was feeling too. She was exhausted, even more so than him. She had been fighting all day. Well, more like all her life, but that was another story. And part of that fight had been with Dusty. Now that it was over, Dusty was ashamed of how he had treated her for so long. They had nearly died today. And if that had happened, then Dusty feared his mother would have died, thinking that he hated her. But that wasn't true.
How does that feel?
Dusty asked, finishing up the bandage. Good, she answered. Thanks. Dusty nodded and then packed up the medical supplies he had used to treat her, while she pulled her jacket back over the wound. Thanks, Lacy said, looking at him.
You said that already,
Dusty said. No, I mean for what you did on the mountain, Lacy replied. If you hadn't showed up, I would have died. It was the first time in a long time that Dusty looked at his mother and didn't feel angry. Maybe it was the fatigue of the day, but there were things he couldn't keep to himself anymore.
One of the things they teach us at school is how to speak with the loved ones of patients we couldn't save, Dusty said. Most kids treat it like a joke, but I guess it's only because they fear doing it in real life. It's a coping mechanism, I guess. But in all the scenarios I've been a part of, I always think about what I would have said if I had worked on Dad. If I'd been the one to tell you that I couldn't save him.
Dusty looked away, unable to hold his mother's gaze as his eyes watered.
I was so mad at you for so long, Dusty said. But all that anger was from grief. It's important to me that you understand that. I never hated you or blamed you, Mom, for what happened. I was just mad.
Lacy reached for Dusty's hand and squeezed. Dusty looked at his mother, who was smiling with tears in her eyes. There is so much I wanted to tell you, Lacy said. So much that I didn't know how to process it myself.
I know,
Dusty said. Lacy pulled Dusty closer and then squeezed him tightly. The pair held one another for a long moment. It had been the first time they'd shown affection toward one another in a long time. Maybe even since the funeral.
Sorry to interrupt,
Tommy said, walking up just as Dusty and his mother separated.
But we need to figure out what to do with this equipment.
Even though the terrorists were dealt with, their weapons of destruction still needed to be dismantled.
I don't suppose you have any idea of how to get rid of all that stuff, do you?
The sheriff looked at Dusty when he spoke. Dusty shook his head.
Your guess is as good as mine.
But I'd start with getting someone from the engineering department at Wake Forest if you can reach them. Or someone from the DOD. Where are we at with establishing communications? Lacy asked, standing up. Dusty remained sitting while the sheriff and his mother sorted out all the weapon details. He didn't have the energy for it and had no idea how his mother was able to stand. You should head back, Lacy said, noticing Dusty dozing off on the bench. Make sure your sister knows everything's over.
Right,
Dusty said, slowly gathering his medical kit and standing up.
I'll see you back at home.
It was the first time Dusty had referred to their house in the woods as home in a very long time. And the moment he spoke it aloud, it was evident how much that meant to his mother. She held back more tears and then nodded. Okay, Lacy said. See you at home then. Before Dusty could leave, his mother wrapped him in another hug, squeezing him tightly.
Easy. You'll pop the stitches, Dusty said.
Lacy finally let him go, and then turned back to speak with the sheriff, and Dusty headed out. It was a long walk back to the cabin. Dusty nearly stopped a few times and considered camping in the woods for the night. But each time Dusty considered stopping, he thought about his girlfriend and sister back at the cabin. They were probably worried and wondering what was going on. So Dusty kept moving forward, knowing that the worst of the day was done. It was nearing nightfall when Dusty finally reached the trail leading down to the cabin. It was a path he'd walked 1,000 times before. And even though it had been over a year since he had returned home, he still remembered where all the tripwires were hidden. The front door to the cabin was closed, and when Dusty stepped inside, he found Katie and Clare on the floor in the living room playing cards. "You're back!" Katie shouted, and she jumped up and sprinted over to her brother, crashing into his legs and hugging him. "We were so worried." Claire stood up and walked over to Dusty more slowly. She was hesitant, unsure of their success.
It's okay,
Dusty said, easing both of their worries. It's over. Claire finally sighed with relief and then stepped forward and hugged Dusty. She rested her head on his shoulder, and the pair lingered in silence. Dusty was glad to be home. He was glad to have Claire there, and he was glad his sister was safe. But while Dusty was distracted, he felt something hard press into the back of his head. And then Claire gasped as she stepped back, grabbing Katie and keeping her behind her. "No one moves," the man said. "No one speaks, no one screams, no one gets hurt." Dusty's heart hammered in his chest, feeling the pressure of the pistol against his skull. Had one of the terrorists gotten away? Dusty wasn't sure, but he caught a glimpse of the man's attire. Hunting boots and camouflage. The terrorists had worn more tactical gear. "Girls, sit on the couch," he said. "Now." Claire grabbed Katie's hand and pulled her toward the couch where they sat, holding on to one another. "Good girls," the man said, and the sick pleasure in his voice curdled Dusty's stomach. "Now, we're all together." "Just let them go," Dusty said. "Take what you want, but leave us alone." "You are what I want," the man said. "I need your help." "Why?" Katie asked. "Because your mommy is gonna come looking for you, and I need to make sure she doesn't know where I've hidden you," he said. "Do you like to play hide and seek?" Katie nodded. "Good," he said. "Because we're going to play it, and I'm very good at hunting. Are you good at hiding?" "Yes," Katie answered. Dusty racked his brain, trying to figure out what to do. The man had a good hold on him, but Dusty couldn't see if the gunman had his finger on the trigger. Before Dusty second-guessed himself, he twisted the man's arm behind him, and for a moment, the surprise caught the intruder off guard. But before Dusty could get the gun in his hand, the man recovered, and this time, there was a blade to Dusty's throat. And the gun was aimed at Claire and Katie. "That was stupid," the man said with an angry lilt. "But I am impressed that you tried. Not very smart, but brave. Stupid and brave. Why do those two always go together, huh?" "Let them go," Dusty answered, pleading. "You don't have to hurt them." "I don't think you understand what I'm trying to accomplish here, boy," the man said. "You and your sisters are a means to an end." "I'm not his sister," Claire said. The man focused his attention on Claire. He tilted his head to the side, examining her, and then he looked at Dusty again and laughed. "You sly dog. I thought it was strange she was here," he said. "I saw in the file she only had 2 children. So you're not related, but you're sleeping together." Claire blushed, and Dusty had never felt so hopeless in his life. He considered trying to steal the weapon again, but the blade on his neck was already drawing a trickle of blood. He'd never get it before his throat was cut. "Stand up for me, darling," he said. "Don't," Dusty said. "Leave her alone." "You're not in control here, son," he said, dropping his voice an octave as he looked up at Claire. "Up." Claire stood, keeping Katie behind her. She didn't tremble, even though she had every right to be frightened. But then again, she had always been the brave one between the pair. My, he said. "You do have a good look about you. Healthy, I would say. Wouldn't you agree?" He looked at Dusty. "Please," Claire said. "Do what you want with me and Dusty, but let the girl go. You don't need both of Lacey's children, do you?" The man sighed. I suppose I don't. But if we're splitting hairs, I don't need you, do I? I mean, you're not related to the forest ranger, and I don't have the patience to try to corral all 3 of you through the woods. So I guess you're right. Someone does have to go." "Wait!" The gunshot and Claire's collapse to the floor were simultaneous. Even though Dusty saw it all happen, his reaction felt delayed by several minutes. But that couldn't have been the case because Claire was still alive, struggling for breath, looking up at Dusty with pleading eyes. Katie immediately started screaming, and then she dropped to her knees next to Claire's side and grabbed her hand. Dusty wasn't sure what his little sister was saying, but as the shock of the event wore off, a rage unlike Dusty had ever experienced before filled its place. Before Dusty realized it, he had reached for the gun in the man's hand, again, surprising him further. This time, Dusty even managed to get them to the floor, but despite the sudden burst of speed and strength his anger had given him, he was also blinded by it. And the hunter quickly regained control. The last thing Dusty saw before he was knocked out was Clare looking at him from the floor. Her eyes were open, and her lower lip quivered. Dusty thought she was still alive, but couldn't be sure, and then everything went black. Chapter 27. Once Lacy, the deputies, and a few of the townsfolk gathered up all the terrorists' gear and weapons, Lacy thought she could put some of it to good use. The radio systems the terrorists used were still operational. Lacy figured they must have stored all their equipment in Faraday cages to ensure that they would still work, even after the EMP was detonated. It took a few tries of scanning frequencies, but Lacy finally contacted an old emergency broadcast the military had tapped into after the EMP had been detonated. Lacy didn't get many details on the status of the rest of the country or how widespread the attack had been. But the military personnel she spoke with assured her that help was on the way. The crowd of townsfolk who had stuck around to listen to her on the radio erupted into cheers when they finally made contact. People smiled and clapped each other on the back, and a few cried. It had been hard for everyone. But the recovery was a long road ahead. There was still no timeline for when the power would be restored, but the fact that the military had some form of communication up and running boded well for the recovery. The fact that this terrorist group had chosen their small town would help them too. The government would want them to get there and know exactly what trouble they were causing. If they were ground zero, it would at least bring attention to the community's other needs, such as making sure everybody had food, water, and medicine. The truth was that the town was better off than most would have been given the circumstances, but that didn't make their trials any less demanding. While the townsfolk congratulated one another, Lacy stood off to the side, choosing to separate herself from the celebration. They might have been happy now, but it was only a matter of time before they all returned to their everyday prejudices about her, hating her for something she didn't do. Lacy turned her back to the crowd, ready to go home and rest, when a hand on her shoulder stopped her. She thought it was Tommy, probably wanting to go over some information she didn't have the patience to deal with. "Tommy, I just want to go." Lacy stopped when she turned all the way around. It wasn't Tommy. It was Deputy Milton and the other townsfolk who had been celebrating together. All of them were focused on Lacy, but she couldn't tell what they wanted. "I don't want any trouble," Lacy said. "I'm just going home."
"Lacy,
Milton lowered his head and struggled to find the right words. He eventually cleared his throat and then stumbled along.
It wasn't fair what most of us put you through after your husband died. Not all of us participated in spreading those rumors. But none of us did anything to stop it."
Of all the things Milton could say, those words were the last on the list. "It's fine," Lacy said, unable to come up with anything else.
"No, it's not,"
Milton said.
"You're as much a part of this community as any of us. We've forgotten that somewhere along the way. But we wanted to make sure that you knew, without a doubt, that you're still one of us. You've always been one of us. We just, got caught up in the moment."
Everyone standing with Milton echoed the apology, and Lacy was speechless. She had been on the outside for so long that she didn't even remember what it was like to be part of the community. She had gone against the grain for the past 5 years, forced into exile by more than choice. Lacy might have survived the past 5 years, but she wasn't sure how much she'd been living. Part of that was because of the self-imposed isolation and partial banishing from the town. Of course, nothing had been official, No decrees had been made, but there was only so much silence and so many dirty looks a person could take before they decided to give up and go somewhere else.
If there's anything you need,
Milton said.
or anything your children need, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us.
Everyone nodded, and the show of support and forgiveness was more than she'd ever expected to receive. It wasn't until she wiped her eyes that Lacy realized she was crying. The tears fell silently, and despite her best efforts, she couldn't hold them in anymore.
Thank you,
Lacy said finally. A few others approached Lacy and personally apologized, while the rest walked up and shook her hand, thanking her for helping the town after they had shunned her for years. Lacy had never been one to keep score. Helping people wasn't a task to be reciprocated. She did it because it needed to be done, and because she was able to do it. That was how she viewed her role as Big Rock's forest ranger. But to hear so many thanks and people come up to her and wish her well after so many years of silence, anger, and betrayal made her feel vindicated. Tommy was the last person to come over, smiling that big, stupid grin he always wore whenever he was happy. "Shut up," Lacy said, wiping her eyes after the tears finally stopped.
I didn't say anything,
Tommy said, still smiling. "You don't have to," Lacy said. "Thank you."
Hey, I didn't put them up to it,
Tommy said.
That was genuinely all them.
"It doesn't feel real," Lacy said, hearing it said aloud. "I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that from everyone until now. I knew I was never in the wrong, but if someone tells you something long enough, you start to doubt yourself. You start to doubt the truth."
The truth always comes out,
Tommy said. Lacy nodded. She had always believed that, but hearing it and seeing the proof was something else entirely. It was the refuel she needed to believe in herself and everything she'd done. "Thank you, Tommy," Lacy said. "You were the one who tried to help my family and me from day one. You'll always have my appreciation for that."
Oh, don't get sappy on me now, Lacy,
Tommy said. Lacy punched Tommy in the shoulder, and then he winced and rubbed it.
That's better,
Tommy said. "I'll see you later," Lacy said.
Tell the kids I said hello,
Tommy said.
And then Uncle Tommy will be over for dinner next week.
"Will do," Lacy said. Lacy was in a good mood for the first time in a long time when she walked home. She didn't have to worry about looking over her shoulder or wondering if someone from town would do something stupid. The tide was turned, and things were finally looking up. It was a peaceful walk back to the cabin. She took her time, knowing the threat had been dealt with and that she and her family would finally have a moment to catch their breath. It seemed that Lacy had been holding her breath for the past 5 years. After the conversation with Milton, she was finally able to exhale. It was a release of so much pressure built up that she didn't even realize it was there. And now it was gone, and she experienced a peace she didn't know existed. Lacy had changed so much since her husband's death. She couldn't remember the last time she thought about something other than getting through the day, but she didn't feel like that anymore. For the first time in ages, she had something to look forward to, and that was getting to her family at the end of the day. The path from the road to the cabin was one of the calmest Lacy remembered having in a very long time. She saw the world around her in a different light, one that wasn't bogged down with fear and guilt. There were still things she needed to tell her children, which would be hard truths to explain, but Lacy finally believed now was the right time. She didn't have to hide what had happened in those woods 5 years ago. She could finally tell Dusty and Katie the truth about their father. Lacy was still floating on cloud 9 when she approached the cabin. She was in such a good mood that it took her a moment longer than normal to realize something was wrong. The front door to the cabin was open. Wide open. Lacy immediately switched back into hunting mode, and she burst through the front entrance of the cabin without hesitation. The interior was a mess, looking as though they had been robbed, but when Lacy turned to the left, she saw Clare on the floor in the living room. She was on her back, clutching her stomach, barely able to keep the blood from pouring out of her. Lacy rushed to the young woman's side and quickly applied pressure to the wound, which triggered a fresh rush of adrenaline from the pain. Clare drew a quick breath and bulged her eyes as she looked up at Lacy. "What happened?" Lacy asked, grabbing a nearby blanket to help stop the bleeding. Clare was shivering as she went into shock. Her face was pale, and it was evident by how the floor was stained red and her shirt was soaked that she had lost a lot of blood. Too much blood. "Man," Clare finally answered through chattering teeth. "He came in with a gun. He took them." "What man?" Lacy asked, thinking that perhaps one of the terrorists had gotten loose and somehow come back to the cabin for supplies. But why they would have taken the kids was beyond her. "He wore camouflage," Clare said. Lacy frowned. None of the terrorists she had seen had been camouflaged. They were all dressed in the same police tactical gear. "He said he was going hunting," Clare said. All at once, Lacy knew Eddie had been there. How he had escaped his cell at the sheriff's station might have been a mystery, but it was apparent he was responsible. But how had he found out where she lived? Clare reached for Lacy's hand, pulling her back into the moment. The girl's grip was incredibly weak. She could barely hold on to Lacy's fingers. "I'm scared," Clare said. The girl must have realized she was dying. Lacy had often wondered what it would feel like to be fully aware of those last moments of life, to know it was over, and it was only a matter of time before that final curtain was pulled over your eyes. "It's okay," Lacy said, squeezing the girl's hand. "Thank you for telling me. You helped. It could mean the difference between saving them and losing them forever." Clare smiled, and a tear fell from her eye. "I did love him. Dusty, tell him." Claire's mouth hung open on the last word, which she could never finish. The final word remained caught in her throat, following her to whatever afterlife awaited her in the next world. Lacy gently closed the girl's eyes. She looked even younger in death, but still just as beautiful, despite all the color fading on her cheeks and lips. Lacy paused momentarily, giving Clare the respect of her death, but Lacy didn't linger any longer than necessary before she stood and got to work. Lacy scanned the rest of the cabin, looking for clues Eddie might have left behind. But the more she thought about it, the more she knew the man would leave her nothing. Clare had mentioned a hunt, and that was precisely what Eddie wanted. It was why he had come there to collect her children. It wasn't the first time he'd used offspring to get what he wanted, but it was the first time he'd come across someone with the skills to stop him. Lacy understood the danger of going into the forest after the man. He was a skilled hunter, the best poacher she'd ever encountered in these woods. But she had caught him before, and she could do it again. But this time, the stakes were higher. Her children's lives hung in the balance. But Eddie had made the grave mistake of thinking this would cause Lacy to misstep, that she would become helpless in her grief. Lacy was angry. She was angrier than she ever had been in her entire life, but for the first time, she didn't have to hold it in. She would focus it, harness it, and use it to bring down the man who had abducted her children. Chapter 28. Lacy grabbed every weapon she believed would help her track down and kill Eddie. She only took what was necessary, knowing it could take days, but her children might not have that kind of time. This mission needed to be handled quickly and efficiently. For every moment Lacy was in the cabin, her children were out in the woods, under the control of a monster. Lacy grabbed her hunting rifle, which she was most familiar with. It had never failed her, and she wanted something trustworthy. She also grabbed a revolver, because she wanted a gun that wouldn't jam. She finished off her ammunition with her hunting knife, scope, camo jacket, and boots. She had no doubts about what kind of fight this would be. It was going to put her through the paces, and she couldn't afford any mistakes. Lacy finished packing and heading for the front door again, stopping to look at the girl on the floor. Lacy hadn't moved Clare, aside from folding her hands over her stomach and closing her eyes. It felt wrong to leave the girl alone, rotting in the cabin. But Lacy didn't have time. She would deal with Clare when she came back and give her a proper burial. Then, Lacy thought of calling up the girl's parents, of having to deliver the news that their beautiful daughter was dead because of a monster who had a vendetta against Lacy and her family. And just like that, there would be someone else who hated Lacy. The town might have accepted her again into the community, but Clare's parents would hate Lacy until they died. And Lacy didn't blame them. She'd carry around that girl's death with all the rest of the weight on her shoulders. Lacy stepped out the door, shutting it behind her, and made a beeline for the woods, but a familiar voice stopped her before she got too far.
"Lacy!"
Tommy shouted, jogging to catch up with her.
"He's gone! Eddie escaped!"
Lacy looked back at Tommy, and he understood something was wrong the moment they locked eyes.
"He was here?"
Tommy asked.
"Are the kids?"
"They're gone," Lacy answered. "He took them." Lacy spun around and entered the woods.
"Lacy, wait!"
Tommy plunged into the woods with her, struggling to keep up. "Stay back, Tommy," Lacy said. "Just go back to town and deal with whatever problems you have there."
"This is my problem,"
Tommy said.
"I'm not letting you go into this alone. You need help. If you let me call for backup, we can team up here and make sure this guy doesn't slip through the cracks."
"Bringing more people will only slow me down," Lacy said. "You'll slow me down. Go home, Tommy."
"Lacy, stop!"
Tommy grabbed Lacy's arm and pulled her back toward him.
"You don't have to do everything on your own. Hasn't everything that's happened today shown you that? It's better to have people who can watch your back."
"I'd like to think that, Tommy, but Eddie is a different kind of animal," Lacy said. "I found him before, and I can do it again. But you're not a hunter. You don't know how to be quiet."
"But I do know how to fight,"
Tommy said.
"And you don't know what kind of trouble the kids might be in. You can't be in two places at once."
Lacy hadn't considered the possibility that the children would be separated.
"You know I'm right,"
Tommy said. "Fine," Lacy said. "You can come, but I'm not waiting for anyone else." Lacy didn't wait for Tommy's reply. She spun around and continued her trek into the forest.
"How do you know you're going the right way?"
Tommy asked. "Look on the ground," Lacy answered. Tommy glanced down and saw the heavy boot prints and what looked like something being dragged across the mud. Eddie wasn't trying to cover his tracks, and Lacy figured there was a good reason for that. Based on the tracks through the woods, it was clear to Lacy that the kids weren't conscious, at least not both of them. It was a bold move to transport the children unconscious. But then again, they would have been easier to control. And Eddie was all about control. Then, the horrible idea that perhaps the kids were more than just unconscious crept into Lacy's thoughts. What if Eddie had already killed them? What if this was some sick game the monster was playing to torment her? Lacy shoved the thoughts aside. It was only a distraction from the mission of finding her children. She would worry about their conditions once she found them, a task easier said than done. The last time Lacy had trudged through the woods like this, with Tommy behind her, was after the death of her husband. It was in a different area of the woods, but the emotions were nearly identical. She prayed she wasn't about to relive that moment when she had found her husband in the forest. He had been acting so strangely that year. The pair had been married for 15 years. They knew each other like the back of their hands. And while her husband had always been a bit melancholy, there was nothing that had made Lacy believe that he was depressed. But she had been wrong. When she studied the moments leading up to that night in the woods, the signs were all there. His absent-mindedness, mornings when he wouldn't get out of bed, and nights when he chose not to read stories to the kids at bedtime. which was his favorite activity. He had brushed it off whenever Lacy brought up the fact that something was bothering him. He would just smile, say he was fine, then kiss her, and that would be the end of it. But Lacy should have pushed harder to figure out what exactly was bothering him. Lacy had allowed herself to believe in the lie that everything was okay and that her husband wasn't depressed. And because she failed to notice the actual warning signs, it had cost him his life. Suddenly, Lacy was transported to that night 5 years ago. The woods were dark, the leaves of fall crunching beneath her boots as she paced through them to find her husband. He had gone hunting alone and hadn't returned by sunset, so Lacy had gone out with Tommy to look for him. Lacy had thought that maybe he was hurt or lost or both. But she knew all his usual spots, and she and Tommy found Sean at one of their hunting blinds. Lacy had been equal parts relieved and angry when she had seen him. She immediately confronted him, asking why he hadn't called or why he hadn't come back. But the moment Lacy saw him, with the way the gun was positioned under his chin, she froze. Sean had turned into someone else. He still had the same rich, hazel-colored eyes, but someone else was behind him, working her husband like a puppet.
I can't do this anymore, Lacy,
he said. Lacy shook her head.
What are you doing? I'm sorry,
he said, tears in his eyes.
It's not your fault. It's not the kids' fault either. Make sure you tell them that.
Lacy feared getting too close. Her husband had his finger on the trigger, and the .45 pistol was enough to blow out the top half of his head.
Honey, just put the gun down,
Lacy said, crying at that point.
Just put the gun down and come home. I want you to come home. The kids need their bedtime story.
Lacy saw her husband again in those eyes for a brief flash of a moment. It was like the person who was holding him hostage had allowed him one final moment to see the world outside before taking him away from his family forever.
You'll have to read to them now.
The gunshot and Lacy's scream were simultaneous. And just like that, in her memory, Lacy collapsed to her knees and struggled to catch her breath.
Lacy?
Tommy rushed to her side and grabbed her by the arms.
What's wrong?
Lacy hyperventilated. She clutched her chest, which had tightened like she was having a heart attack. She cried, just as she had done then, and Tommy held her by the shoulders.
Lace?
Tommy asked.
I can't lose them, Tommy. Not like I lost Sean. I can't.
Lacy repeated the phrase several times until she broke into sobs, then leaned forward and hugged Tommy.
You're not going to lose them,
Tommy said, holding Lacy up.
I promise you. That's not going to happen. I still don't know why he killed himself, Lacy said. I've gone over it 1,000 times, but I can't see it.
He was sick, Lacy, Tommy said. He was just really good at hiding his symptoms.
I should have seen it,
Lacy said.
I should have stopped it when I had the chance. I could have saved him.
Tommy leaned back so he could look Lacy in the eyes.
I don't know why he chose to kill himself, but it wasn't your fault. It doesn't feel that way, Lacy said. It feels like I should have known. I know, Tommy said. But one day, you'll see it the way I do, and you'll forgive yourself for it.
Lacy wiped her eyes, thankful for Tommy's help. She had underestimated how difficult it would be, especially considering her history. But Tommy was right. She didn't have to do this alone.
Come on, Lacy said. We need to keep moving.
Lacy tried to keep her emotions in check, knowing she couldn't afford another outburst like that one when they moved closer to Eddie. He had purposely done everything he could to throw off her game. And despite her best efforts, it was working.
You should tell the kids,
Tommy said.
What?
Lacy asked.
You should finally tell them the truth, Tommy answered. I think that's part of the guilt you're feeling. I know why you kept it a secret. You wanted to protect them, but they deserve to know what really happened. And the sooner they learn it, the easier it will be for them to process it.
I know, Lacy said, but it just feels like too much time has passed. They'll hate me for lying to them all these years.
They'll be mad, but their anger will fade, Tommy said. Anger never lasts.
Lacy wasn't so sure about that. Because if anything happened to her children, if Eddie hurt them, she didn't think she would ever feel normal again. The rage that would burn in her heart would burn all of her. One way or another, it would all end soon. Chapter 29. The deeper they traveled into the woods, the harder it was for Lacy to keep track of Eddie's trail. And with the sun setting and night taking over the skies, it was going to become increasingly difficult to keep them on target. They eventually hit some rocky terrain, making it harder to track, but Lacy called upon her years of experience and managed to find Eddie's path up the mountain. It was a steep climb, and Lacy found it hard to believe that Eddie had managed to carry both Dusty and Katie on his own. She wondered if he was working with someone else, and then remembered how solitary the man had been at his campsite. He didn't work well with others, and there was no reason for him to partner with anyone now. That led Lacy to believe that Dusty must have been conscious and had helped carry Katie up the trail. If anything, it meant Dusty was alive, and that boded well for Katie too. Lacy clung to that thought, holding on to it as though it were a life vest in a stormy sea where she was struggling to stay afloat.
Are you sure we're going the right way?
Tommy asked quietly as he struggled to keep up with Lacy's frantic pace.
Yes,
Lacy answered, but she noticed the doubt in her tone. Despite her skills at tracking, she had to admit that it was possible she would lose the trail, especially as the terrain grew rockier. But just when Lacy was about to stop and question herself, she saw something wedged in the rocks above that caught her eye. If it hadn't been for the clear skies above, with the moon and stars providing some light, then Lacy never would have seen it. She walked over and kneeled on the rocks as she reached for the piece of cloth stuck in the crevices. It was a piece of Katie's shirt. Lacy figured Dusty must have left it for her to find, or perhaps it was Eddie himself. It was obvious to Lacy that Eddie wanted her to chase them. Maybe this was his way of making sure she walked right into whatever trap he had set. Regardless of who had put it there, Lacy was sure she was on the right track now. All she had to do was keep pressing forward, trust her instincts, and fight the fear that threatened to leave her in a crumbling mess. Lacy found a few more pieces of clothing, and from there they reached the top of the mountain, giving them a bird's-eye view of the surrounding forest. There were several lookout points like that all around the forest, all of them providing stunning views. But the one at the Welcome Center was the only trail that had been blazed for the public. But the one thing Lacy wanted to find at the top of the mountain was nowhere to be seen.
What now?
Tommy asked. Lacy studied the ground, struggling to pick up the trail Eddie had left behind, but the longer she stared at the rocks, the more panic crept into her thoughts, clouding her judgment and eroding her confidence.
I don't know,
Lacy answered. They came up this way, I'm sure of it, but I can't find where they went. The lookout was near the cliff's edge. The only other way forward was the tiny tip of the mountaintop, less than 20 feet away. This tip was too narrow and steep to climb unless you had the necessary gear. Beyond the tip of the mountain was the long, rocky ridge, a challenging hike for even the most experienced. Lacy considered going to the top to look around, but Tommy noticed something near the cliff's ledge.
Lacy, look,
Tommy said, pointing to a tree sprouting from the cliff's side. Lacy didn't understand what Tommy was looking at first. The tree was swaying in the breeze, but then Lacy noticed the direction in which the tree was moving. It was bobbing up and down, not side to side in the direction of the wind. It was as if something was dangling from it. Lacy carefully approached the cliff's edge. The rock face was unstable in these parts, especially after the rain they'd received. At least 100 hikers had fallen to their deaths on the edges of these cliffs around the park, thinking they were sturdy enough to hold them or that the hiker was sure-footed enough not to slip, only to plummet to their deaths. Lacy tied off a rope to the tree that was firmly rooted to the ground and attached the other end around her waist. Once the rope was secure on both ends, Lacy carefully tested the ground with each step as she moved toward the edge, but when she finally was close enough to peer over the edge, her heart stopped.
Dusty!
Lacy shouted. Dusty was suspended, dangling from his left arm by a rope tied around a tree limb. The limb Dusty was suspended from was 15 feet down the cliffside. His body dangled in freefall, and it was obvious to Lacy that Dusty was unconscious. Lacy fought the urge to go down and get him the moment she saw him. Thankfully, a cooler head prevailed, and she was able to work through the problem. Lacy had done plenty of rock climbing over the years, and she had done a few rescue operations with climbers who had performed extractions in remote locations like that. So she was familiar with the protocol. The worst thing she could do was rush down there and get them both stuck. She needed to find a path and secure a means to bring them both back up to safety.
What do you want to do?
Tommy asked. Lacy knew Tommy couldn't climb, but he was strong enough to pull Dusty up so long as Lacy could wrap a rope around him. She studied the rock face and saw a path she could follow down. The footholds were spaced far apart, but she had worked on more at the rock climbing wall in town. Of course, there was a cushioned mat at the climbing center if she fell. Lacy didn't have all the necessary gear, but the ropes she had brought in her pack would be enough to keep her secure on the way down. At least, she hoped. Lacy tied off another anchor for the rope that she would use to hoist Dusty back up once she reached him. Once the rope was in place, Lacy showed Tommy how to ensure there was enough slack for her to go down. "Just nice and easy," Lacy said. "I don't want you to put too much on the rope too quickly, and you'll want to keep a nice bend in the rope between me and the tree. Don't wrap it around you, but keep enough bend so you can control it."
"Right, got it,"
Tommy said. Tommy was a big guy, and his weight would be helpful in this situation. Because Tommy outweighed Lacy by a good 60 to 80 pounds, she wasn't afraid she would plummet to her death. But at the last second, Lacy glanced around the woods, wondering if this was a trap Eddie had left for her. It wouldn't have been the first time the monster had used offspring to snare his prey. But the longer Lacy studied the surrounding landscape, the more confident she was that he wasn't around. He had moved on, taking Katie somewhere else, acting as one final trial. Lacy reapproached the ledge, and then steadied herself and made sure Tommy was good before she dipped over the edge. "Remember, nice and slow," Lacy said. Tommy nodded, and then Lacy took that first step off the edge as she rappelled. The tree from which Dusty was dangling made it difficult to descend the cliff's side. She was forced to go down on the left side of the tree, where she had a better angle of reaching Dusty from the branch. All went well at first, but Lacy saw a problem as she moved closer to Dusty. The branch Dusty was tied off on was far too thin to hold his weight, and his bouncing up and down from the swaying tree was only adding more stress to the already burdened branch. "Dusty?" Lacy asked, shouting against the wind roaring and billowing below her. "Dusty!" Dusty remained unresponsive as he dangled from the rope, and Lacy couldn't tell if he was breathing or not. She needed to get to him quickly before it was too late. "All right, that's enough," Lacy shouted, hoping Tommy heard her over the sound of the rushing wind, which was much louder against the side of the cliff. "Tommy, stop!" It wasn't until the second command that Tommy finally heard her. She was lower than she wanted, but she figured the extra slack might come in handy once she moved over to the tree. Lacy was careful to find her footing, trying to strike a balance between moving quickly and not wanting to lose her grip. She understood that she had the rope, but if she did fall, then it would only waste more time, not to mention the toll it would take on her busted shoulder. Lacy had no anchors to set the rope, so she had to keep the slack with her to ensure it didn't catch on any of the branches as she neared the tree. "Dusty, if you can hear me, you need to wake up," Lacy said, hoping to grab her son's attention, and then she considered the fact that if he remained unconscious, then perhaps he wouldn't be freaking out that he was dangling off the side of a cliff. Perhaps it was better that he stayed unaware of his current predicament. Once Lacy was near to the tree, She readied the rope she would tie around Dusty for Tommy to hoist him up. The branch Dusty dangled from was at least 10 feet from the cliff face, swaying in the middle of the air. Lacy tested the tree trunk with only half her weight, making sure her added weight wouldn't rip the roots from the rocks. But as she slowly applied all of her weight, the tree didn't move, and Lacy crawled toward the far branch where her son dangled. Moving along the tree was a far slower process than going down the cliff face, and far more dangerous. The bark of the tree was smooth and slick, and Lacy had to hold the smaller branches to guide herself and make sure she didn't fall over the side. Even with the slow progression, Lacy moved closer and closer to her son, but when she neared the branch her son was tied to, she had to stop. The harsh bend of the branch was too extreme for Lacy to trust it with her added weight. She would have to get the rope around Dusty from a distance. Lacy created a slip knot in the rope for Tommy and attempted to slip it over his waist and beneath his arms. It was a slow and arduous process, and every time Lacy failed, she fought the urge to climb onto the branch. She thought maybe if she was quick enough it would work, but each time she considered it, the wind caused the branch to bend even more. She was running out of time. Lacy finally managed to get the open loop around both of Dusty's ankles, slowly worked it up his body, and closed it around his waist. She was dripping sweat, and her muscles were burning from hanging onto the branch, but after Dusty was secure, she allowed herself to get a moment of relief. "Okay," Lacy said, shouting up to Tommy. "Get ready."
"Okay,"
Tommy shouted.
"I'm letting go of your rope and getting Dusty's."
Lacy watched her son dangling from the branch, holding onto the rope. She needed to move into a better position for Dusty to be pulled up, and for that to happen, she needed to remove the rope he was attached to, or Tommy wouldn't be able to pull Dusty up. But because Lacy had the rope secure around Dusty, she chanced the bending branch to cut the rope he was dangling from. But as she did, the branch jerked down harder. Lacy thought the branch was breaking, but then she heard Dusty below. He was waking up.
"Oh my God!"
Dusty shouted, screaming and thrashing as he realized he was dangling out in the open air.
"Dusty, stop moving!"
Lacy shouted, watching the branch buck and bend wildly every time Dusty flailed. He was too lost in fear to hear her, but if Lacy couldn't free him from the rope on the branch, then they'd never be able to hoist him up. Dusty's wild motion finally caused the first crack in the branch, and Lacy's heart skipped a beat. She scrambled forward to reach the rope before the branch gave way, but she wouldn't reach it in time. Instead, Lacy had to grab the branch itself as it separated from the tree. Dusty was in free fall for only a second, but it was enough to trigger another blood-curdling scream. Lacy's arm nearly jerked out of its socket as she held onto the branch, but the boost of adrenaline provided the needed strength for her to hang on.
"Dusty!"
Lacy shouted, and that time her voice overpowered his screams. Dusty finally glanced upward and saw Lacy's red, sweaty face staring down at him.
"Grab hold of the rope around your arms!"
It took a moment for Dusty to orient himself and find the rope, especially since there was another one tied to his arm, but he eventually found it. The arm used to hang from the rope on the tree branch was useless, but he used his one free and good arm to grab the rope Lacy had slipped around him and started pulling him up. Lacy wanted him to clear the tree before Tommy pulled them up, but Lacy didn't think they had the time.
"Tommy!"
Lacy shouted.
"Pull up now!"
"Got it," Tommy replied. Lacy kept hold of the branch until the slack in the rope finished and Dusty was pulled up the first few inches. Dusty was clearly terrified, but the fact that he was moving upward instead of downward helped calm him down.
"You're doing great, son,"
Lacy said.
"Just hang on."
Dusty nodded, exhausted from the endeavor, but just as Lacy was about to turn around, she felt and heard the crack of the tree against the rocks. Lacy glanced behind her at the tree trunk snapping at the base, where it was attached to the cliff face. Her added weight and Dusty's flailing must have put too much stress on it. Lacy tried to crawl back to the rocks, but another large crack formed in the tree, and this time, it snapped completely. The tree branches struck Lacy and Dusty as they tumbled down the side of the cliff. Then, Both were slammed hard into the rocks as Tommy's grip on the rope slipped from the sudden shift in momentum. Lacy smashed her lousy shoulder into the rocks, and she yelped from the pain. She spun around a few times, spinning like a top, until she finally managed to grab one of the footholds along the cliff face. She was spent from the climb down and holding onto Dusty's branch, and Lacy's entire body was shaking as she clung to the side of the cliff. She glanced over to her left and saw that Dusty was still spinning, unable to reach the rocks. "Dusty, you have to try to reach for the side of the cliff," Lacy shouted.
I can't stop spinning,
Dusty shouted.
Tommy,
Lacy shouted.
keep pulling. Hold on, I gotta get my footing back in place,
Tommy shouted, and then, after a short pause, he started pulling Dusty up the side of the mountain again. Lacy breathed relief as she watched her son go up the cliff. She lingered at the bottom for a moment, catching her breath as she prepared to climb back up, but it wasn't until Dusty was pulled up over the side that Lacy finally allowed herself to relax.
Okay, I'm going to pull you up next,
Tommy shouted. Okay, Lacy shouted. Lacy was glad Tommy had come. After the ordeal she'd just gone through, she didn't have the strength or coordination to climb up the rocks. And she still needed to conserve her strength to find Katie. But then, as they slowly made their way up the mountain, Lacy heard a familiar noise. It was a ripping sound, and she glanced up the rope and saw that it was fraying a few feet above her. One of the branches must have cut it, or it sliced against one of the jagged rocks when she was slammed into the mountainside. However it happened, the rope was going to snap at a moment's notice. "Tommy, go faster!" Lacy stressed the urgency in her voice, and Tommy picked up the pace as she quickly ascended the rock face. Lacy couldn't keep her eyes on anything save for the fraying rope, which seemed to dissolve faster the quicker she was pulled up. Lacy momentarily glanced past the frayed rope and toward the edge of the cliff that was growing closer and closer. And she stretched her hand to reach for it just as the final threads unraveled. Lacy felt her stomach drop the way it used to when she rode roller coasters when she was younger. She felt her stomach rising as her body fell, but her fingers brushed the edge of the cliff, and she held on. Lacy dangled there, unable to pull herself all the way up. And just when her grip was about to give way, a large hand wrapped around her wrist.
Gotcha,
Tommy said. Tommy heaved Lacy up over the side and dragged her away from the side of the cliff. It wasn't until they had a good 20 feet from the cliff's edge that Lacy collapsed onto her back. Lacy's heart hammered wildly, each beat sounding like a kick drum echoing throughout her body. She rolled to her side and saw Dusty on his back, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he closed his eyes. Lacy forced herself to her hands and knees and then crawled to her son. "Dusty? Hey, Dusty, it's okay." Dusty had tears in his eyes, and she realized he wasn't breathing heavily, but sobbing. He shook his head, his eyes bloodshot from the tears.
"It was all my fault, Mom. I couldn't stop him. I tried. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry."
Dusty tried speaking a few more times like that, but everything that came out of his mouth was incoherent. Lacy pulled her son close and held him as he cried into her arms. She would have stayed there with him for as long as it took to calm him down, but Katie was still out there. Lacy needed to find her. "I'm going to have Tommy take you back into town," Lacy said.
"What?"
Tommy asked, standing nearby.
"Lacy, you're in no condition to go ahead on your own like this."
Lacy gestured to Dusty's injured arm, which was turning purple from the lack of blood flow. "He needs to go to a doctor in town, or he will lose that arm."
"I won't leave you,"
Dusty said, but his tears and voice made him sound like he did when he was a little boy. "It's okay," Lacy said, gently touching Dusty's cheek. "This is how it's supposed to be. I'm your mom. A mother protects her children. And that's what I'm going to do." Lacy glanced at Tommy, and when he saw her face, he understood there was no convincing her otherwise. Lacy helped Tommy get Dusty to his feet, and then the sheriff propped him up on his side. "Do you know your way back?" Lacy asked.
I can manage,
Tommy answered. Lacy nodded. Just keep heading due southwest. She reached for the compass and placed it in Tommy's palm. That will get you to the Welcome Center from here. The closest location to the main road. Hopefully, some of my rangers will still be there and they can help you get into town.
You sure you want to go this alone?
Tommy asked. I'll be fine, Lacy answered.
Mom,
Dusty said before Tommy pulled him away.
I love you.
It wasn't that Lacy believed her son hated her, but the pair had been at odds for so long that she had forgotten how good those words sounded. I love you too, Lacy said.
I love you more than you could ever know.
Lacy hugged Dusty again, and then let him go, watching Tommy slowly lead them back down the mountain toward help. Lacy waited until she couldn't see them in the darkness anymore, and then she turned her sights to the ground around her. She studied it, searching for the trail she was certain Eddie had left behind. It took some time, but Lacy finally found it. She was tired, hurt, and running on fumes. But she was fighting for something Eddie couldn't understand. The love a mother had for her children. He was about to discover what happened when you messed with a mother's child.